Good morning and welcome to the Point. This week we sat down with Governor Rick Snyder. We talked about the just concluded legislative session, what was accomplished and what he would like to see done next year. But first, we started talking about that new data center proposed in Gaines Township and what he thinks about the tax proposal. Governor, you and I have talked about the data storage, company's name Switch, Pyramid. I think we've said everything we can say about it, except now we can say that the legislature has come up with a plan somewhat different than the first plan. They took a long time, relatively, when you think about the speed with which this needed to move, to talk about, deliberate its tax policy, and it deserves some conversation. What is your take on the process? I don't think you've seen the final product yet, at least not in an official form.
Right, and I can't comment on the final product yet, Rick, and I make a careful review, but to give you some of the issues involved quickly is, first of all, you had to decide, is it one company kind of specific thing or is it a broader exemption for an industry? And again, good policy is you don't like to do one thing, particularly for an out-of-state company, versus saying if we're going to do something, it should be appropriately done for an industry. So that was one of the questions, and I think clearly it's moved in the industry direction. Beyond that, then, what taxes does it apply to? At one point they talked about personal property taxes and then sales and use tax. Well, it appears it's more focused on sales and use tax now. So that was a decision made that is appropriate, probably, given good tax policy. Now the question is it fair compared to everything else, and what are the revenue implications? Again, it's important we balance our budgets, in my view, and I want to be fiscally responsible. So the fiscally responsible part of the question, I'm doing a separate analysis on the tax policy piece of this. The question that comes down to is, there is a great policy question. Is this somewhat akin to industrial processing? Because this is not a tax credit. This is an exemption for a category of tax, the sales and use tax. Sales and use tax are traditionally retail. And if you think about it, if one manufacturer sells to another while they build a product and they come out with a good, something tangible, they don't pay sales and use tax on that. You pay it when you buy it. Well, the question is, and I think this is an interesting question for somebody like me in particular, good nerd question, is this akin to industrial processing for cyberspace? This whole issue of data centers and all this kind of stuff, because they're really manufacturing something in cyberspace that comes out of this. And so the part I can say, this could be part of the reasons to say it could be good tax policy is it's roughly equivalent to industrial processing in cyberspace.
Does that, just as you're saying that, it makes me think, if that is something that is manufactured in cyberspace, does that become a taxable commodity for me, the consumer?
Well, again, there is some questions that, when you go into the store and buy software, you'll pay sales and use tax on that. There are some questions now in the future about downloaded software and other things like that. That is a fair tax policy question that we probably still need to address better at the state. And one of the reasons we don't have the full answer is some of these industries are evolving so fast. These are new questions. I mean, that didn't exist how many years ago? So again, I think you're asking good questions.
Let's talk about this as an industry. We know, because they certainly surfaced when this proposal came up, there are other groups doing something like this. As an observer, and you again would be in a better place to know this because of your background and some of your interest in these kind of industries. Is this I hate to use the phrase game changer, is this a substantial step for the state to be in this cutting edge technology, or is this just another step?
I would say we wouldn't be cutting edge, but we'd be near the front. And that's probably a good place to be on some of these. In some of the cases, you clearly know, and some of the things I like to be, I want us to be out front, number one. Career tech education is a great illustration of that, and the skilled trades. In other cases, on some of these policy things, in order to manage what you could find in litigation or other court suits or other issues or problems, sometimes it's good to be in that batch that's sort of close, but not on the very front edge.
Let's take a look back at this year. You and I talked on Mackinac Island. You talked about your feeling of really anticipation about the next 3 years because there's so much more you want to get done. But before we talk about that, and before you give me the text of your state of the state, let's talk a little bit about what was accomplished from your perspective in the year just passed.
Well, this was a good, strong year for Michigan. Economically, we did well. We hit the national unemployment rate. If you look at it, that's great. We hadn't been that low in how many years? 15 years? That's wonderful. In terms of the job creation itself, 420,000 private sector jobs over the last few years. That's number 5 in the country, number 1 in manufacturing jobs. So a lot of great things are going on. Again, we still have more work to be done. People are still out there looking for employment, but this is the whole thing about making for 2015, 16 and beyond the skilled trades, career tech education priorities, getting transportation funding done, finally getting a roads package. That was relentless positive action to get that done. That took about 3 years. But it's the largest package of new revenues we're going to have in over half a century. That's exciting to improve our roads. A number of other important things took place in terms of healthcare, training, public safety. So I feel good about the year. I just want to keep going. I'm excited for Michigan's future.
Well, next year, one of those big issues that I suspect you'll be focusing on early on is the energy policy that began. The conversation has been going on. You pointed out there is some timeline associated with that. It maybe didn't have to be done by the 31st, but you'd like to get it done relatively soon. What's your sense on where the state is, where the legislature is on that, given that there are some serious questions about choice and alternatives and who gets to decide and what we use as baseload generation, given that coal is largely going to go the way of the dinosaur, not to make a bad pun, but I mean, that's kind of where we're going.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. That is a high priority of mine, and that's something critically important because it can set the stage for the next 20 or 30 years for energy policy, or longer. And so I think there's a lot of thought going into it. There are a lot of good reforms. This is our opportunity to do something as I describe it. How can we have an adaptable policy that adapts to changing circumstances such as market pricing and federal policy, but yet improve our affordability, reliability, and environmental sustainability? And that is something I'd really like to get done in the first half of the year. For the legislative agenda, they have their own items, but clearly energy policy is at the top for me. We have things like Detroit education, criminal justice reform, some other important things. So it's going to be an important session after we come back.
Let's talk about Detroit Public Schools. That is always a difficult issue because some people are unsure as exactly what Detroit Public Schools look like. How many students are you dealing with? Which of those students are going to go to alternative schools that are outside the public school system? All of those things. How do you get your arms around that and then convey that back across the street to the legislature and say this is what we need to do? Because there are people in this state, and I know you've worked hard, as other governors have, to try to remove the Southeast Michigan versus all the rest of the state. But there still are some people who have questions about putting money into Detroit, despite some of the progress we've seen.
Yeah, one thing we need to improve education for all kids in Detroit. And there are other places in the state. Again, we've seen improvement in Grand Rapids. There's more work to be done. So what I would say is, in terms of making an investment in Detroit, in terms of Detroit public schools, there's a couple things. One is, don't we want to help the kids across our state? So I hope people have the spirit to say, this has been going on for 40 or 50 years. We have an opportunity, much like we did with the city of Detroit through the bankruptcy, to say, and we're not talking bankruptcy here, but how do we actually get to stability and then growth? And isn't it exciting when you see progress? Look at the city of Detroit for many people. So we can have better education in Detroit. The other thing is the state is one of the largest creditors for Detroit public schools. In fact, not just the state, but the retirement system covers all the school districts, including Detroit's teachers, public school teachers. So if there's major issues that are not done proactively through a legislative solution, there's a situation that could arise that would end up in court, not necessarily bankruptcy, but court brought by creditors, that could end up costing every school district more in the state of Michigan, and the taxpayers of the state of Michigan much more money. So this is a case where I hope people see the positive reasons, but also understand that doing this proactively in a structured fashion is a much better answer than relying on the court system to come to an answer that could be much worse.
Given some of the priorities you've laid out for the coming year and some of the things we know that have been accomplished, categorize what you know about working with the legislature today that you didn't know in 2010.
Oh, that would be a long list. Because again, I was new to Lansing. The good part is I've had a great relationship with the legislature. We've gotten a lot done, but it's also respecting that we're partners. So it's not like the governor just comes in and says, this is what I want you to do. And I have to respect the fact that they have their own agenda items, their own thought processes, and you have to work out common ground. Transportation would be a great illustration of that. Again, that was quite an endeavor. and we had more than one stop and start. But I think we came to a good outcome. And in some ways, that's the way our system's set up, is compromise is not a dirty word. It can be an effective word because it meant everyone got a chance to contribute their thoughts. Did everyone get what they wanted? No. But did you come out with an outcome that's better than not doing something? And this is clearly a case of yes.
Does the pace bother a guy who spent his entire life in the business world, where sometimes deadlines and getting things done are kind of a motivator, whereas here the same thing happens, but it happens at midnight before the session is going to expire? Does that kind of lack of urgency until the last minute kind of go against the grain of somebody from the business world?
Well, I always want to go faster. Everyone knows that. I like to say I like to work in dog years. 7 to 1 is the relationship. But it's a case of, I respect that. The other benchmark I use is, how is Michigan doing and how do we work as a team compared to other states? And it's incredible what we've gotten done. We are the comeback state, and we should be really proud of that. Compared to where we were, again, I mentioned we're number 5 in job creation. I can show you a forecast. We were forecast to be number 50. And it's because of great teamwork. We've helped create an environment that has allowed free enterprise to work. So I try to be positive in that regard. But I did have one instance last year, actually at the end of last year during the road funding thing, where I actually ended up having to stay up all night. So I did get a little grumpy and make the comment, I went through all those years, 3 degrees worth of education and never pulled an all-nighter, and now I am 50-some years old staying up all night. This is not a positive.
Finally, Governor, when we're sitting here next year, I'm being optimistic that you'll invite me back. If we're sitting here next year, what is something that you would like to say, I know you laid out some of the priorities, but is there anything else that you're going to tell us in early January about your vision that will be something that you'll say that made this year a success?
Well, yeah, one of the things I talked about last year's State of the State that we are continuing to work on, and I want to continue to bring up and talk about, is this concept of the river of opportunity, which is actually flipping how the whole government works. Because again, if you look at state government and all government in many respects, what's happened over time is we keep on adding more and more programs. We tend to, that are good programs, well-intentioned ones to help people, but we sort of end up taking a person and putting them as a bunch of program participants. And so they lose some dignity in that. And too often we're dealing with symptoms and not root causes of their issues. And what I want to do is get back to saying, let's treat people as people. Let's have government focused on them as real people. Let's give them great customer service. Let's find the root cause of their issues so they can be less dependent on government and be more self-sufficient whenever possible. Let's get the community involved. The answer is not always just government. It shouldn't be just government. It's how we all help one another. And let's really promote this as a way to say, we're here to serve the people. And let's do it better and better.
When we come back, we will talk about the terror threat in America with Congressman Fred Upton. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Congressman Fred Upton has been serving in Washington for more than 2 decades. He has seen a number of terror threats come and go, but as we sat down to talk about the current threat in America, he says he takes it very seriously. We have to start with the thing that I said earlier before we started. I said, I think this is going to be the most important thing on people's minds, and you said it's been your experience. It's number one, and it's the fear of terrorism in this country, post-Paris, post-California. You've seen it before after 9/11. It's different, as it always will be. It's different now. What's your take on where we are and what we as a country ought to be doing and thinking?
Well, first of all, everyone wants to be safe. And we're a little rattled right now. Paris certainly did that. I can remember we were in session, and I remember my wife, yelling to me, "Hey, you won't believe, that afternoon what's happened in Paris." We all just were shocked, particularly when you saw that it really wasn't senseless. They were doing this with full intention, killed so many different people and just random executions. But I think it was 139.
Yeah, big number.
We saw what happened in California. First, again, our reaction, is this another, terrible case where, just a person with a gun wanting to do something? But then, obviously, the links now to terrorism and ISIS and things that continue to happen. Earlier today, as we talk, another more trouble in Paris. So we want to be safe. And a couple weeks ago, I was up in New York for a big Republican event, and I went through the 9/11 museum. I would welcome anyone to go through that. We relived all that we experienced in '01, and I was, of course, in the Capitol that day, was on the House steps when we sang "God Bless America" at the end. But to see that again firsthand, to see the actual girder, the steel girder, where the plane hit, bent, the 911 tapes, the fire trucks. I was in New York a couple days afterward. I went to the Pentagon the next day as well, as I was then the chair of the telecommunications subcommittee, so very important in terms of the reaction of things that happened. But you know, my family thought I was dead. They didn't hear from me. I was almost before cell phones, not quite, but those of us that had, you couldn't get through. The network was too busy, overloaded.
I'm going to stop you there for a minute, because I think it's difficult for people who perhaps weren't there to get a sense of how the desperation was for our families. I was over in the Longworth building. We were seeing smoke coming up from what we thought was the mall and what immediately people assumed was the White House. As it turned out, it was the Pentagon, as you point out. But we moved most of the principal staff to my apartment because it was the closest area, and we had all of these cell phones lined up on top of a window ledge trying to get service. So you didn't have cell phone service. You were thrown out of the Capitol.
I was frankly scared to go into. I was over in the Hart building that morning, right outside Debbie Stabeno's office. As soon as I saw the TV, I said, "This is not a Cessna." That's what we thought it was initially. So I took the stairs, didn't take the elevator. Ran to my car. I had a Sebring convertible, top down. It was a beautiful day, as you remember. And I was almost out of gas. I don't do that anymore. And I just sat in front of the South Capitol Metro, and my car people were just packed around it, listening to the WTOP, the CBS all news radio. But people were scared to go into buildings because you heard the planes flying overhead, breaking the sound barrier. Yes, you saw the smoke over here, that air. I mean, people were in the streets frightened, but that's not quite obviously where we are today in terms of terrorism. But we have to implement a system that works. That, you know, as our governor said, he wants a pause until we know that the answers to the questions have been answered. What is the background of these folks? Have they been in some of these training camps? I was in Europe twice earlier this year, once leading a delegation, the other one being part of one, to Eastern Europe, talking about energy, looking at Ukraine, looking at energy as a diplomatic tool that we might be able to use, whether it be natural gas or crude oil, all those different things. And one of the questions that we asked in Paris and Berlin and in Brussels, as well as in the Ukraine and Tunisia, we were there right after the terrorist attack in Tunisia, where these folks came in literally sprayed with grenades and machine guns, killing 20-some folks at a museum, killing their tourism trade, obviously. But what is happening in Europe as it relates to all of these refugees that are leaving these failed nation states? That's the cause of what's happened. By not having a policy of containment or some structure of continuity, you can imagine that literally millions of people from Iraq to Syria to Libya to, you know, a number of those nations are scared to death. They don't have a job. They've got maybe a family. They don't have education, health care. They know what's available in Europe. They know what's available in the West, obviously here. And like any family, they're trying to flee that reign of terror that they're experiencing firsthand. So the difficulty is, you know, whether you get on a boat and you cross the Mediterranean, or you cross a border into Turkey and then have access to the other nations in the EU, where do they go then? And they don't have the documentation. And as we've had a refugee program here for some time, all of a sudden, there's no way that, frankly, our embassies can see a paper trail, because there's no one to call in Syria. There's no one to say, well, you know, what's the background of this individual? What, you know, do they have a felony record? I mean, all the things that you might normally be able to do, you can't. And some of these people have been in refugee camps for years. You know, Jordan's got hundreds of thousands of folks that are living there. So it's it's very difficult, but we've got to figure that out before we really see an exodus of these folks coming here, because we know that ISIS has been able to obtain passport information, actual passports and machines that can print them. So this is one of the things that they want to do. They want to infiltrate with some of their terrorists to come into this country, and we need to do everything that we can to lock that down.
One of the reasons I was happy to have that conversation about 9/11, and you pointed out this is a different circumstance. This was much smaller scale, but it was also the kind of thing that was much harder to detect. I mean, looking backwards, had we had some of the security measures in place that we have now, we might have discovered some of those folks who were trying to hijack airplanes.
That's right.
But going forward, we have to be able to find that smaller cell, that radicalized person or 2 or 3 people who maybe aren't contacting a lot of other folks, and part of that has to do with knowing who's coming into the country. However, there have been some, particularly in the superheated presidential race, that have suggested banning a particular religion, saying no Muslims can come in. Donald Trump said that just last week, and you responded to that without it. That was not acceptable.
And it's not acceptable. It's not who we are. Of course we want to be safe, but you don't blanketly say we're not going to accept this religion. I mean, it's, as we know, 99.999 Muslim. I mean, they're coming here for our way of life. I've got a couple colleagues that are Muslim in the Congress. We have people throughout our communities, very legitimate folks, whether it be physicians, attorneys. I mean, you can't do that. That's not who we are. Let alone figure out how is it going to work. I mean, is someone just are they going to lie? I mean, someone made a joke, I think, on one of the late night shows. Are you going to give them the bacon test? I mean, good grief. I mean, it doesn't work. It shouldn't, and it speaks ill of what our country's values really are. But not to say that we don't need to fix the system that can do everything that we can to prevent folks who have that terrorism training, who want to do us ill, to come in. Now, we've had a number of classified briefings in the last couple of weeks, not only by the head of the FBI, we've had some in our subcommittee as well, particularly on the issue of encryption. So what do you do when you have a court order by the FBI, or the court has confirmed that, in fact, this particular individual needs to be on some type of watch list, that there's actual evidence that can convince a judge that they need to be tracked. And yet the device that they have, it's not like the old phones or mail,
right,
but it's an actual device now that's encrypted in such a way that the company that makes it you don't have a door, a front door or a back door, to allow the legal authorities to be able to track who are they talking with, what is, perhaps, again, all with a court order, what is the content of that language. It's one of the issues that's developing now with the San Bernardino case. Can we actually figure out who these folks communicated with 3, 4, 5 years ago? The answer, at least so far, is no. But
this also points out the complexity, and this is again where your committee may be called upon, the communications part of it, the complexities of how do you track folks, because they have technology that is continually evolving. One of the things that we saw previously in the hunt for Osama bin Laden, it would come out in the media that our intelligence officials were monitoring his cell phone. Well, he would start to communicate in a different way. And the same with the current group of terrorists. As soon as they believe that the government or the global investigation has learned their processes, they change them.
Yeah, but now the process is such a way that they know that we can't be able to figure out who they're communicating with, because there are some dark devices that don't allow the FBI, even with a court order, to be able to have access to those communication links. And that is the real difficulty now that our law enforcement people are finding. And it's, whereas before, you had that technology, we don't necessarily have it today, which makes it scarier. Then when you look at the process of allowing folks in without being able to conduct a proper background check, we got trouble, which is one of the reasons why Congress, on a bipartisan basis, strong, 2 weeks ago now, said folks that have been in Syria or Iraq, you're not coming. Not on the visa waiver program. You're going to have to actually go and be interviewed before you have access to come to the United States.
Our thanks to Governor Snyder and Congressman Fred Upton. We'll have a final thought when we come back in just a moment. So now the state legislature as well as Congress have adjourned for the holidays, and there won't be a lot going on in terms of new initiatives. However, over the next couple of weeks, we've got a lot to talk about. A big election is coming up next year, and we'll be talking with the chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party, Brandon Dillon, and the chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, Ronna Romney McDaniel, about how they think Michigan will play in Decision 2016. I hope you'll join us then. To the Point